Russia's economy has been running under sanctions since 2022, excluded from SWIFT, frozen out of Western markets, its foreign reserves seized. On paper, this should have crippled Moscow. That was the plan, but over the last several months, while the world's attention has been locked on the Strait of Hormuz, on Iranian missiles, on American carrier groups, something quieter has been happening in the background. And I don't think enough people are connecting it to what's actually at stake here, which is not just an oil choke point. It's the entire financial architecture that has kept the United States the most powerful economy on earth since 1974. Today I want to show you how Russia has been using this Middle East crisis, a crisis it didn't start and doesn't fully control, to accelerate something it has wanted for over a decade, the end of dollar dominance in global energy trade. Let's go. First, I need to give you the actual mechanics of what we're talking about, because most coverage of de-dollarization is vague. It's a buzzword people throw around without explaining how it actually works. So let's be precise. In 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia struck an agreement. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in dollars, and in exchange, America would guarantee Saudi security. That single agreement created something extraordinary. Every country on earth that needed oil, which is every country on earth, now needed dollars first. That artificial demand is what economists call the petrodollar system, and it's the invisible engine underneath American financial power. It's why the US can run massive deficits without collapsing its currency. It's why sanctions work. It's why the Treasury market absorbs trillions in foreign capital every year. The dollar isn't just a currency, it's infrastructure. And infrastructure is exactly what Russia has spent the last 3 years trying to build an alternative to. Now, here's where Hormuz comes in. When Iran began restricting and taxing passage through the strait as tensions escalated, oil prices didn't just rise, they became volatile and unpredictable in a way that spooked energy markets globally. Volatility is expensive for everyone who buys and sells oil in dollars, because dollar-denominated contracts assume a certain level of stability. But volatility is not expensive for a country that already has an alternative payment channel with its biggest customer, and Russia has exactly that with China. Here's the number that matters. Because of Western sanctions cutting Russia off from European energy markets, Russia has become almost entirely dependent on China as a buyer for its oil and gas. China knows this. China has used that leverage to negotiate steep discounts, sometimes reported in the range of $10 to $15 per barrel below global benchmark prices. Normally, you'd think that hurts Russia. Selling at a discount is a loss, right? Except when the alternative is not selling at all. And that's the position sanctions put Moscow in. So Russia takes the discount, but here's the part that matters for the petrodollar story. Those transactions increasingly bypass the dollar entirely. They settle in yuan through China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, which China has been building for years, specifically to reduce reliance on the dollar-based SWIFT network. Every barrel of Russian oil sold to China in yuan is a transaction the US Treasury cannot see, cannot tax, cannot sanction, and cannot use as leverage. That's not a side effect. That is the entire point of the system China and Russia have been constructing. Now overlay Hormuz on top of that. As the crisis in the Strait pushed global oil prices higher and made dollar-denominated Gulf oil more expensive and less reliable for Asian buyers, China had every incentive to lean even harder into its yuan-based arrangement with Russia. Higher, more volatile prices out of the Gulf made the discounted yuan-settled, sanctions-proof Russian supply chain look more attractive by comparison. In other words, the very crisis that was supposed to be about Iran and American power projection ended up strengthening the exact bilateral system that removes the dollar from the equation. Moscow didn't create the Hormuz crisis, but Moscow benefited from every day it continued, because every day of Gulf instability was another day pushing energy-hungry countries toward alternatives to the dollar-priced, dollar-settled system that has underwritten American power for 50 years. Let's talk about the institutional side of this, because it's not just Russia and China acting alone. This is a coordinated project, and the architecture has a name most people have heard, but few actually understand: BRICS+. As of the last several years, this bloc, which now includes major oil producers, controls a substantial share of global oil production. And what they've been building isn't just a talking club, it's payment infrastructure. China's CIPS system is explicitly designed as an alternative to SWIFT. Russia has its own equivalent called SPFS. There have been ongoing discussions and pilot projects, including a cross-border central bank digital currency initiative, informally referred to in some reporting as the MIM Bridge project, exploring real-time settlement between BRICS-aligned central banks without ever touching the dollar system. None of this is secret. It's published in central bank statements and BIS reports. What's changed is the incentive to actually use it, and Hormuz volatility is one of the biggest incentives to appear in years. Here's a detail I want you to sit with. Saudi Arabia itself, the country whose 1974 agreement with Washington created the petrodollar system in the first place, has been diversifying. Reports over the past 2 years indicate Saudi Arabia has been open to yuan-denominated oil sales to China, something that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. That doesn't mean Riyadh is abandoning the dollar. It means the exclusivity is gone, and once exclusivity is gone, the system stops being a wall and starts being one option among several. That shift didn't start with the Hormuz crisis, but the Hormuz crisis and the price instability it created gave every hesitant country a very concrete, very visible reason to accelerate a hedge they were already quietly building. Now let's talk about why Russia specifically is positioned to exploit this better than almost any other actor. Iran is the country actually fighting. China is the country quietly buying discounted oil and building payment rails. But Russia occupies a unique middle position. It is simultaneously a major oil exporter competing with Gulf supply, a strategic partner of Iran that benefits from anything that destabilizes American-aligned energy infrastructure, and the country with the most battle-tested experience at operating outside the dollar system, because it's been doing exactly that since the 2022 sanctions hit. Every workaround Russia built to survive being cut off from SWIFT, shadow fleets, ship-to-ship transfers, non-dollar settlement, insurance schemes routed through non-Western entities, all of that infrastructure is now a template, and templates spread. What Russia learned surviving sanctions, Iran is now applying to survive the Hormuz standoff. What Iran and Russia are both doing, China is quietly formalizing into permanent payment infrastructure. This is not three separate stories. It's one supply chain of financial innovation, and every link in that chain was forced into existence by American economic pressure. I want to be fair here because I always want to steelman the other side before I make my case. So let's take the strongest argument against everything I just said. The dollar has been declared dead many times before, and it's never actually happened. The dollar still accounts for the overwhelming majority of global reserve holdings and international trade invoicing. China's own capital controls make the yuan fundamentally unattractive as a reserve currency, because a currency people can't freely move in and out of isn't a real reserve asset. Alternative payment systems like CIPS still process a tiny fraction of what SWIFT processes globally, and crucially, no country wants a fully de-dollarized world, because the entire global financial system, including Chinese and Russian holdings, is built on decades of dollar-denominated assets. Burning that down would hurt Beijing and Moscow just as much as Washington. This is a serious argument. It has history on its side. Every prediction of imminent dollar collapse over the last 50 years has been wrong. But here's what that argument misses. Nobody serious is claiming the dollar collapses overnight. That's not how currency transitions work. Historically, they take decades. What's actually happening is erosion at the margins, and margins are where the entire system's stability actually lives. The dollar doesn't need to lose 50% of global trade to lose its dominance. It needs to lose the assumption of inevitability. Once large economies routinely have functioning alternatives for a meaningful slice of their trade, the leverage the US gets from sanctions starts to weaken because the threat of exclusion only works if there's nowhere else to go. Hormuz didn't destroy the petrodollar system, but it gave Russia, China, and a growing list of energy-dependent nations a very public, very costly demonstration of what happens when your entire trade relies on a choke point and a currency controlled by a country that can weaponize both. That lesson doesn't get unlearned. Let's look at what this actually does to the three legs the petrodollar system stands on, because I think this is the clearest way to understand the stakes. Leg one, oil pricing. As long as oil is priced predominantly in dollars, demand for dollars stays structurally high. Every yuan-settled barrel chips away at that leg. Leg two, recycling. Historically, oil exporting nations took their dollar revenue and reinvested it in US Treasury bonds, which is part of what funds American deficit spending. If Gulf states and Russia increasingly diversify where they park their surplus, that funding channel narrows. Leg three, sanctions leverage. The entire coercive power of the dollar system depends on there being no viable alternative rails. Every dollar of trade that moves onto CIP or bilateral currency swap arrangements is a dollar the US Treasury cannot freeze, track, or weaponize. None of these legs need to collapse for the system to weaken. They just need to erode faster than they're being replaced by newer sources of dollar demand. And right now, all the evidence points to erosion outpacing replacement, specifically in the energy sector, specifically because of instability originating from the Gulf. Now, here's the part that I think is genuinely underappreciated. Washington's own policy response to the Hormuz crisis has been in many ways accelerating exactly the outcome it's trying to prevent. Sanctions on Iranian shadow fleet vessels push more tankers into anonymous non-dollar payment arrangements. Freezing Iranian assets as leverage teaches every watching country, including Russia, including China, including Gulf states hedging their bets, that dollar-denominated reserves held in Western institutions can simply be seized when politically convenient. That lesson is not lost on central bankers in Riyadh, in Beijing, or in New Delhi. Every time the US demonstrates that dollar access can be turned into a weapon, it strengthens the argument inside the finance ministries of dozens of countries for building the exact kind of parallel infrastructure Russia has spent 3 years perfecting out of necessity. So who actually wins from all of this? Not Iran, whose economy remains under enormous strain regardless of the strategic picture. Not the United States, which is watching a system built over 50 years get quietly hollowed out by a crisis it didn't fully control. The winner, if there is one, is the country that already knew how to survive outside the dollar system before this crisis even started, and had every reason to want the rest of the world to learn that lesson too. Russia isn't fighting in Hormuz. Russia doesn't need to. Every missile fired, every tanker seized, every day the strait stays contested is another data point proving Moscow's argument to the rest of the world that dependence on the dollar and on American guaranteed shipping lanes is a vulnerability, not a strength. And Moscow has spent 3 years building the exit ramp for anyone who wants to listen. Let me give you 3 specific things to watch over the next few months, because that's how you test a theory like this, instead of just accepting it. First, watch the settlement currency data on China-Russia energy trade. If the share of transactions settled in yuan continues climbing while Hormuz remains unstable, that's a direct measurable link between Gulf volatility and de-dollarization in real time. Second, Watch Saudi Arabia's public statements on currency flexibility for its oil sales to Asian buyers. Any further movement toward accepting yuan for even a portion of its exports to China would be one of the most significant signals available, because Saudi Arabia is the country whose 1974 decision built this entire system in the first place. Third, watch central bank gold purchases. Russia and China have both been accumulating gold reserves at an elevated pace for years, a classic hedge against dollar exposure. If that accumulation accelerates further during continued Hormuz instability, it tells you central bankers are actively preparing for a world with less dollar dependence, not just talking about one. Here's your homework. Go look at the Bank for International Settlements data on cross-border payment system usage. It's public, it's published quarterly. Compare CIPS transaction volume before this Hormuz crisis and during it. Then look up the discount Russia has reportedly been selling crude to Chinese refiners and calculate